And now Hugh Laurie continues his reading of The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Dr. Watson has been sent by Sherlock Holmes to keep an eye on the goings-on at Baskerville Hall and to report back to him in London. Watson's uneasy with the atmosphere at the hall. He's convinced that some great sorrow haunts the butler's wife, though Barrymore himself denies it. Then he discovers the man creeping through the house at night to keep watch from an upstairs window.
Baskerville Hall, October the 15th. My dear Holmes, before breakfast I went down the corridor and examined the room in which Barrymore had been the night before. The western window, through which he'd stared so intently, commands the nearest outlook onto the moor. It follows that Barrymore must have been looking out for something or somebody on the moor. It had struck me that it was possible that some love intrigue was afoot. That would have accounted for the uneasiness of his wife, and the man is a striking-looking fellow, very well equipped to steal the heart of a country girl. That opening of the door, which I'd heard after I returned to my room, might mean that he'd gone out to keep some clandestine appointment. I had an interview with the baronet in his study and told him all I'd seen. He was less surprised than I'd expected. I knew Barrymore walked about nights, and I had a mind to speak to him about it. Perhaps then he pays a visit every night to that particular window, I suggested. Well, perhaps he does. If so, we should be able to shadow him and see what he's after. We'll sit up in my room tonight and wait till he passes. Sir Henry rubbed his hands with pleasure, and it was evident that he hailed the adventure as a relief to his somewhat quiet life upon the moor. The baronet has been in communications with the architect who prepared the plans for Sir Charles, so we may expect great changes to begin here soon. It's evident that our friend means to spare no expense to restore the grandeur of his family. When the house is renovated, all that he will need will be a wife to make it complete. Between ourselves, there are pretty clear signs that this will not be wanting if the lady is willing, for I have seldom seen a man more infatuated with a woman than he is with our beautiful neighbour, Miss Stapleton. After our conversation about Barrymore, Sir Henry put on his hat and prepared to go out. As a matter of course, I did the same, but Sir Henry put his hand upon my shoulder. My dear fellow, I know Holmes told you to keep an eye on me, but with all his wisdom, Holmes didn't foresee some things which have happened since I've been here. I'm sure that you're the last man in the world who'd wish to be a spoil-sport. I must go out alone. It put me in the most awkward position, but before I could say anything, he was gone. When I came to think the matter over, my conscience reproached me bitterly for having on any pretext allowed him out of my sight. So, guessing he'd gone in the direction of Merripit House, I set off after him. When I came to the point where the moor path branches off, fearing that perhaps I'd come in the wrong direction after all, I mounted a hill from which I could command a view. Sir Henry was on the path, about a quarter of a mile off, and a lady was by his side who could only be Miss Stapleton. It was clear they'd met by appointment. They were walking slowly along in deep conversation. I was standing among the rocks watching them, very much puzzled as to what I should do next, when I was suddenly aware that I wasn't the only witness of their interview. A wisp of green floating in the air caught my eye. It was Stapleton with his butterfly net, and he was moving towards them. At this instant, Sir Henry suddenly drew Miss Stapleton to his side. His arm was round her, but it seemed to me that she was straining away from him with her face averted. Next moment, I saw Stapleton running towards them, gesticulating wildly. He seemed to be abusing Sir Henry, who offered explanations which became more angry as the other refused to accept them. Finally, Stapleton turned on his heel and beckoned in a peremptory way to his sister, who, after an irresolute glance at Sir Henry, walked off by the side of her brother. I was so deeply ashamed to have witnessed so intimate a scene that I ran down the hill to the baronet. For an instant, his eyes blazed at me, but my frankness disarmed his anger, and he broke at last into a rather rueful laugh. "You would have thought the middle of that prairie a fairly safe place for a man to be private," said he. But by thunder, the whole countryside seems to have been out to see me do my wooing. And a mighty poor wooing at that. Did you see her brother come out on us? Yes, I did. Did he ever strike you as being crazy? I always thought him sane enough until today, but you can take it from me that either he or I ought to be in a straitjacket. What's the matter with me anyhow? Is there anything that will prevent me from making a good husband to a woman I loved? I confessed I was completely puzzled. Our friend's title, his fortune, his character, are all in his favor. That his advances should be rejected so brusquely without any reference to the lady's own wishes, and that the lady should accept the situation without protest, is amazing. However, our conjectures were set at rest by a visit from Stapleton himself that very afternoon. He'd come to apologize. He said that his sister is everything in his life, and the thought of losing her was terrible to him. He recognized how foolish and selfish it was to imagine that he could hold a beautiful woman like her to himself for her whole life, but he needed time to prepare himself. He offered to withdraw all opposition if Sir Henry would promise for 3 months to let the matter rest, and to be content with cultivating the lady's friendship during that time. And so the matter rests. We are to dine at Merripit House next Friday as a sign that the breach is quite healed. And now I pass on to another thread which I have extricated out of the tangled skein, the mystery of the sobs in the night and of the secret journey of the butler to the western window. Congratulate me, my dear Holmes. These things have been thoroughly cleared up. The first night I sat up with Sir Henry to no avail. But the next night, some time after 2, we heard the creak of a step in the passage. The baronet gently opened his door, and we set out in pursuit. We stole into the other wing, just in time to catch a glimpse of the tall, black-bearded figure, passing through the same door as before. We shuffled cautiously towards it, trying every plank before we dared to put our weight upon it. When we peeped through the door, we found him crouching at the window, candle in hand, his white, intent face pressed against the pane, exactly as I'd seen him 2 nights before. The baronet is a man to whom the most direct way is always the most natural. He walked into the room, and as he did so, Barrymore sprang up from the window and stood trembling before us. "What are you doing here?" demanded Sir Henry. The fellow wrung his hands in misery. I was doing no harm, sir." "So why were you holding a candle to the window?" "Don't ask me, Sir Henry. I give you my word, sir, that it's not my secret, and that I cannot tell it. If it concerned no one but myself, I wouldn't try to keep it from you." A sudden idea occurred to me, and I took the candle from the window-sill where the butler had placed it. "He must have been holding it as a signal," I said. "Let's see if there's any answer." I held it as he had done, and stared out into the darkness of the night. Vaguely I could discern the black bank of trees and the lighter expanse of the moor. Then I gave a cry of exultation, for a tiny pinpoint of yellow light had suddenly transfixed the dark veil. "There it is!" I moved the light across the window. The other light moved also. The baronet glowered at Barrymore. "Now, you rascal, do you deny that it's a signal? Who's your confederate out yonder? What's going on?" The man's face became openly defiant. "It's my business, and not yours. I won't tell." "Then you leave my employment right away, and you go in disgrace. By thunder, your family's lived with mine for over 100 years under this roof, and here I find you deep in some dark plot against me." "No, sir, not against you." Mrs. Barrymore, paler and more horror-struck than her husband, was standing at the door. "It's my doing, Sir Henry. John has done nothing except for my sake, and because I asked him. My unhappy brother is starving on the moor. We cannot let him perish at our very gates. The light is a signal to him that food is ready, and his light out yonder is to show the spot to bring it." "Then your brother is—" "The escaped convict, sir. Selden." Sir Henry and I both stared at the woman in amazement. Was it possible that this stolidly respectable person was of the same blood as one of the most notorious criminals in the country? I know that he's dragged our name in the dirt. From crime to crime, he sank lower and lower, and it's only the mercy of God which has snatched him from the scaffold. But to me, sir, he was always the little curly-headed boy that I nursed and played with. That was why he broke prison. He knew I was here, and we couldn't refuse to help him when he dragged himself here, weary and starving, with the waters hard at his heels. Every second night, my husband has checked to see if he was still there, and if there was an answer, he took out some bread and meat. Every day we hoped that he was gone, but as long as he was there, we couldn't desert him. Is this all true, Barrymore? Asked Sir Henry. The butler nodded. Well, I can't blame you for standing by your own wife. Go to your room, both of you, and we'll talk further in the morning. When they were both gone, we looked out of the window again at the tiny point of yellow light. Both Sir Henry and I knew that the man was a danger to the community, an unmitigated scoundrel for whom there was neither pity nor excuse. It wasn't as though the Barrymores had taken us into their confidence. Their secret had been forced from them. We decided it was our duty to put him back where he could do no harm. In 5 minutes, we were outside the door, stumbling slowly along in the darkness with the craggy hills around us. I say, Watson, said the baronet, what would Holmes say to this? How about that hour of darkness in which the power of evil is exalted? As if in answer to his words, there rose suddenly out of the vast gloom of the moor that strange cry which I had already heard upon the borders of the great Grimpen mire. It came with the wind through the silence of the night, a long, deep mutter, then a rising howl, and then the sad moan in which it died away. Good heavens, Watson, said the baronet. It was the cry of a hound. My blood ran cold in my veins, for there was a break in his voice which told of the sudden horror which had seized him. What do they call this sound? He asked. The folk on the countryside. I hesitated, but could not escape the question. They say it is the cry of the Hound of the Baskervilles. He groaned and was silent for a few moments. It was one thing to laugh about in London, and it's another to stand out here in the darkness of the moor and to hear such a cry as that. I don't think that I'm a coward, Watson, but that sound seemed to freeze my very blood. Shall we turn back? No, by thunder. We've come out to get our man, and we will do it. There's nothing so deceptive as the distance of a light upon a pitch-black night. And sometimes the glimmer seemed to be far away on the horizon, and sometimes it seemed within a few yards of us. But at last, from behind a boulder of granite, we could see a guttering candle stuck in a crevice of the rocks. We crouched in the shelter of the rock and waited. At length, there approached an evil face, all seamed and scored with vile passions, foul with mire and hung with matted hair. As I sprang forward, the convict screamed out a curse and hurled a rock which splintered against the boulder which had sheltered us. He turned to run, and we rushed over the brow of the hill after him. We were both fair runners, but we soon found that we had no chance of overtaking him, as he disappeared with great speed down the other side. We watched for a long time in the moonlight, until he was only a small speck on the side of a distant hill. It was as we turned for home that there occurred a most strange and unexpected thing. The moon was low on the right, and on a jagged pinnacle of a granite tor, I saw outlined as black as an ebony statue the figure of a man. Do not think that it was a delusion, Holmes. I assure you that I've never in my life seen anything more clearly. As far as I could judge, the figure was that of a tall, thin man. I wished to go and search the tor, but the baronet was in no mood for fresh adventures, so we returned to the hall and have decided tomorrow to send word to the Princetown people where they should look for their missing man.
Hugh Laurie has been reading The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The programme was abridged and produced for Radio 2 by Jane Marshall Productions.